Greetings. We appreciated the response that has come from the message on anticipating Purim, and I want to continue on that theme as I'm speaking today in March of 2024. I'm speaking on the Sabbath preceding that holiday. The Purim holiday is coming up. And so for those of you who will be celebrating it, as we are here, Chag Purim Sameach, Happy Purim to you. For those of you who may not be celebrating it, but I would still recommend that around this time of year that you do read the Book of Esther. And I'm going to talk more about that today. It is the fifth of the festival scrolls, and that is the title of my talk today, the fifth festival scroll. That's what I call my talk today. I want to say more about that particular book and some lessons that come from it. I spoke last week about divine providence, and I talked about the dollar bill in America with the eye of divine providence on the back, and the saying "Annuit Siptis" or Septis. And I think a better translation maybe than what I gave last week would be, "He has favored our undertakings." Our founding fathers in America, as I pointed out last week, did believe in divine providence, and we even have one of our states in America, Rhode Island, whose capital is Providence. You may have heard about the minister who, when he had a daughter, he wanted to give that daughter a biblical name, so he chose Esther as her name. Now, his wife really enjoyed reading the stories of Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, the famous Mark Twain, and she wanted to name her daughter Polly. So that's why the daughter wound up being named Polyester. Hope you like that story. Now, Purim is a time for humor. This year, of course, it will be more subdued because of the nature of what's going on. We have a struggle going on now very similar to the struggle that took place at the time of Purim, and so it won't be quite as frivolous as it often is. But just to give you an example of what does happen on Purim in the synagogue. Many years ago, I was in Anaheim, California, on Purim. We lived there at that time, and we were at synagogue there. And one of the elderly men in the congregation asked the rabbi, there are 10 chapters in the Book of Esther. He asked the rabbi, what happened to chapter 11? And he answered, it went bankrupt. But that's the kind of discussion you're going to get at Purim time. I want to go to Matthew 24 and verse 44. Matthew 24 and verse 44. Who is then that faithful and wise servant whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Oh, food in due season. Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you, that he will make him ruler over all his goods. Now, in the winter time, you might want a good hot meal. In the summertime, you might want a very cool, refreshing beverage. Spiritual food is like that too. There are certain times when you need certain spiritual food, and it's interesting too that the way the Bible is organized, there are in effect seasonal readings. Doesn't mean you can't read something else at that time, or you necessarily must read certain things at a certain time. But I will say this: I gave a talk on this subject some time ago, and in I believe it was in Kentucky, and I should have added this point, that if you're aware of the way the Bible is organized seasonally, you're going to wind up reading a lot more of the Bible than you might otherwise. There's certain parts of the Bible that people tend not to read so much, but if they were trying to stay in season, they might take a look at certain parts of the Bible that normally are somewhat neglected. So we might keep that in mind. Now, the way the Old Testament is organized, I'm talking now about the Hebrew Bible, the law, the prophets, and the writings, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The way they're organized, you have the 5 books of Moses. And then you have also the 5 books of Psalms, and you have an appendix on that book of 5 Psalms that kind of tie in with each of the books. 146 ties in with the first book of Psalms, and all the way through 150. So you have the Psalm 1 through 145, and in 5 books, and then you have 5 a kind of appendix of 5 Psalms at the end that thematically tie in with the 5 books of Psalms. And you also have the 5 festival scrolls. Now, if you looked at the book of Jeremiah, the 5th chapter, in the Old King James, Jeremiah saw a flying roll. Was he in a bakery? No. It's a flying. The modern translation will say a flying scroll, and the word for that in Hebrew is Megillah. He saw a Megillah, and the root is galal, to roll, and I think that's why we have the Galilee. I think the rolling hills of the Galilee gave it its name. So you have the Megillot, or sometimes it's pronounced by an American reader Megaloth. You have the 5 Megaloth. That's not a geological term. The Megaloth are festival scrolls. And so in the spring, during the days of unleavened bread, that's the season for Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, Canticles, Song of Solomon. And then in late spring you have Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, or the Festival of 50th Day, Pentecost in Greek. And so you have the Book of Ruth ties in there. In midsummer, you have a mourning period, fast days, and the Book of Lamentations is read. Then you come to the 8 days, the Festival of Tabernacles and the 8th day of Sacred Assembly, and you have Kohelet, you have the Book of Ecclesiastes. Finally, you come to the end of the ecclesiastical year. You come to the end of the ecclesiastical year, the 12th month, sometimes the 13th month, as it is this year, and you have the Book of Esther. Now, God shows his love in the Bible, often symbolically, in 5 ways. 5 in a way is symbolic of God's love. If you speak French, think of the word amour, right? 5 letters. Or if you speak Italian, think of amore, 5 letters. Or if you speak English, think of grace, Grace, 5 letters. But I want to go to a couple of examples to show you how God shows his love in the Bible symbolically through 5. I want to go to Leviticus 26 and verse 8. He's talking about blessings here. And he says, 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Those are all multiples of 5. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. So you see, just one example. I want to give you one from the New Testament. And then let's go to 1 Corinthians 14. 1 Corinthians 14. And I want to go to the 19th verse. 1 Corinthians 14. Now, what if all of a sudden I should start speaking Swahili? How much good would that do you? And I only know a few words in Swahili, so it might not do me any good either. Maybe I wouldn't even understand what I was saying if there was some miracle that just caused me to start speaking in Swahili. So as I said, it would be impressive to you. It would be impressive to me, but you wouldn't be. There wouldn't be a lot to learn there. But don't worry about it. You're not going to be hearing a sermon today in Swahili. So, Hakuna Matata. Anyway, I want to go to 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 19. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 19. And Paul says, yet in the church, I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding that I may teach others also. I would rather in the church I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding that I may teach others also than 10,000 words in a tongue. And again you see the symbolism of 5 there in that scripture. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a couple of examples of the symbolism of 5 in the Bible. So today I want to talk about the 5th festival scroll and some lessons that we can derive from the Book of Esther, which Saturday night this year in 2024, as I'm speaking, what is the date today on the secular calendar? 22nd? This is March 22nd, I think, right? So I believe so. So anyway, on Saturday night, it will be Purim, and all through the world, in the synagogues, they'll be reading the scroll of Esther. And also that next morning, in the traditional synagogues, they'll be reading Esther also again in the morning. But I want to talk about some lessons from Esther, and I already referred to one, and we talked about it a lot last week, and that is the idea of divine providence. And you see that in the Book of Esther, everything is set up ahead of time, so when the crisis comes, people can do what they need to do. God has set things up for them, although he's not mentioned directly, but yet, obviously you see his hand there, you see divine providence. And I want to go to the second chapter of Esther and point out something that I didn't discuss last week, and that is that even besides the fact that Esther was chosen to be queen, which was of course a major part of this whole account, also something else happened. Here, Haman. If you ever go to synagogue on Purim, that's what you'll hear when you hear Haman's name. But anyway, when Haman wanted to destroy the Jews, and then later on he wanted to particularly hang Mordecai ahead of the rest, and yet Mordecai had done the king a great service, and that does figure into the plot later on, into the story. So I want to go to Esther, the second chapter, and so even here we find so many aspects of God's providence, preparing the way to save his people. This Sabbath, the Sabbath before Purim, in the synagogues, they'll be reading out of Deuteronomy about the Amalekites. And the Amalekites, in a sense, were the terrorists in biblical times. And it may be that Haman was a descendant of the royal line of Amalek. And Mordecai may have been a descendant of Saul. So you had a descendant of Saul and a descendant of Agag, centuries later. The struggle continues, so to speak. Anyway, I want to go to verse 19. The kings in those days had harems. Even Solomon, who was a Jewish king, an Israelite king, he ruled over Israel and Judah. So you could call him a Judahite king, but an Israelite king. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Obviously, it's not what God wanted the king of Israel to do. So the kings in those days were that sort. And some of the reasons why that happened was to make alliances with other countries. Some of it was political. But anyway, so even though the virgins were gathered together and Esther was chosen as queen, later on, I suppose the king wanted to add to his harem, so more virgins were gathered together. So we go to verse 19 of Esther 2. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate, and Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. Well, there's a lot I could talk about there, but I'll move on. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And by the way, his reign did end much later, but he was finally assassinated later, this time though he escapes. So the matter became known to Mordecai. Somehow he got wind of it, he might have been around and heard the plotting, and they didn't know that he was there. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book, in the Chronicles, in the presence of the king. And yet, Ahasuerus was ruling over an entire empire, and he was planning an invasion of Greece. And, for whatever reason, he didn't get back to Mordecai to do anything particularly to honor him for this. That happens sometimes, even in modern times. I'm thinking of a very extreme case. There were these Navajo Indians or Native Americans that helped the United States during World War II. They communicated in Navajo, so the Japanese didn't know what they were talking about, couldn't break the code. Anyway, so I'm trying to think of the name. I think they were called the Code Talkers. There was a movie made about them some years back, but I don't think they were honored until the 1990s, until they properly received their honor. So sometimes that happens. So anyway, nothing was done about it. But then in Esther 6, after the king had given Haman the opportunity to annihilate all the Jews in the empire, mass genocide, here we have finally the king remembering to honor Mordecai, and there's a lot of irony in this, and there's also humor in this. In fact, I want to sort of transition from divine providence to also the concept of humor. You do see humor in the Book of Esther, particularly in the 6th chapter. And Purim has been traditionally, as I said, a holiday which is quite joyous and a lot of humor involved. And I do want to go to the book of Proverbs. I am going to go back to Esther 6, but I want to go to Proverbs 17. Of course, there's a time to mourn and a time to laugh. We understand Ecclesiastes. There's a proper time for mourning, a proper time for joy. But in Proverbs 17 and verse 22, it should be Proverbs 17, verse 22. It says, "A merry heart does good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones." So it is good to have a positive outlook. It is good to have a sense of humor, and I think you'll find if you study the lives of famous comedians, you'd be surprised how many of them lived a very long time. Now, obviously, if you abuse your body, if you have some kind of very bad habits, out of the ordinary, but if you just live an ordinary life, as most people do, I think you'll find comedians do tend to live a long time. But anyway, it is good to have a sense of humor. And the Bible does have humorous episodes. And I did a series of short videos on humor in the Bible with the help of my son Daniel. He did the graphics. And so they're available if you go back to to our channel on YouTube. And they were done some years ago, but they're still there as far as I know, these little snippets of humor in the Bible. I want to go to Esther 6. And here it says that night the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the chronicles that were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. So Mordecai had told of them. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the court. Why? He had just, he was building a gallows on which to hang Mordecai. He was about to ask that Mordecai be hanged. Now Haman had just entered the court in the king's palace to suggest that the king had hanged Mordecai on the gallows they had prepared for him, really high gallows. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." Haman was a trusted advisor to the king at this time. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done to the man for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Then Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be put, which the king has worn, and a horse. Let a royal robe be brought, which maybe I said that, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then and let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, then parade him on a horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And I suppose at this time Haman was so nonplussed, he didn't want to bring up Mordecai's ethnic background. It might not have been such a good idea to question what the king wanted to do. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. And you'd think that the king would remember, hey, I just made an order to kill the Jews. But somehow, I guess he felt, well, I'll still honor this man, even though his people are destined for destruction. It's kind of strange. But anyway, at this point, it wasn't in his conscious memory what he had allowed Haman to do. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. And so the irony of this, and this is a very popular thing that Jews talk about on Purim, even this noisemaker I have here, this grog or this ra'ashan, I don't know if you can see on the camera, I'm holding it up, you can see the illustration of Haman leading Mordecai on horseback there. As I said, it's a very famous, you can all see that? Mm-hmm. Good, wonderful. Linda says that you can see it, and I know that she knows what she's talking about. Okay, so anyway, it goes on to say, so Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. When I was a little boy, we had a song in English about this event. You probably can find it on YouTube. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered, which is evidently in the ancient Middle East a sign of mourning. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his, she's the one that I think suggested that he have him hanged, Mordecai hanged. Then when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. So they had a sense of foreboding that even though he had gotten the king's permission to wipe all the Jews out and take all their property, this seemed to be a turning of events, and indeed it was. It was a sign that events were turning. And ironically, what happens next? If you keep reading. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And that's where it came out, and Haman's doom was sealed, if you keep reading. So as I said, this is divine providence, but also there is a certain humor here. Now, a third thing I want to bring out, a lesson from the Book of Esther, is the fact that those who keep God's commandments are going to be vulnerable to persecution. You know, if you follow the Bible, in some ways you may agree with the society, but in some ways you're going to disagree, depending on where you are and when you are. Pardon me. So your values are the values of the Bible. And, you know, they may or may not be in harmony with the society around you. And you will be vulnerable to persecution. There are a lot of scriptures on that subject. And so I'll just refer you to Esther 3:8. And then I'll refer you to what Jesus says about his followers in his prayer in John 17. And then I'll also refer you to 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12. You know, that if you are a godly person, sooner or later, you know, persecution will be there. But of course, God will help you through it. Divine providence, as I mentioned earlier. So divine providence is something we learn from the Book of Esther. We see humor in the book. We see that humor is something we should be aware, we should have as a part of our personality. We also see that unfortunately, but yet it's the real world, that commandment keepers, people who follow God's commandments, are vulnerable to persecution. Now, a fourth point I want to bring out, and this is of course the very good news, is that ultimately God is the winner, and so those who follow God, you know, also of course are the winners. And I want to go to Esther 9 and verse 1. Now in the 12th month, it is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, that time that would be, of course, this year, this day that I'm speaking now. Now in the 12th month, now the Jews celebrate the 14th of Adar when they rested after the victory on the 13th, and some cities would celebrate it on the 15th for reasons you can read about in the book. So let's call it the days of Purim, Adar 14, Adar 15. But in most cases, it's the 14th. That's the day of celebration. But it kind of spills over to the 15th. In some areas, in Jerusalem, the 15th is the big day. Anyway, now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But if you know the book, you know the king, of course, sent out a new order giving the Jews the opportunity to defend themselves, and they did quite well. The opposite occurred. Let's go back. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. And so there was a complete reversal, and that's ultimately what's going to happen. The persecuted minority will ultimately be the kings and priests in God's kingdom. And we find here in, if you go back to the 8th chapter, in verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. You know, this verse is so upbeat that Orthodox Jews read this verse every Saturday night, and then they say, "So may it be for us." Excuse me, I want to go now to verse 17. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, this is the second decree, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews fell upon them. So actually the Jewish community grew in power and influence and even in numbers. Now, some people want to translate that many people wanted to appear to be Jews. You know, in other words, to protect themselves, they sort of acted as if they were Jewish, or in order to save themselves. So it could mean that, but it could also mean that many of them actually did join themselves to the community. But in any case, it is foreshadowing the wonderful world tomorrow, the awesome age ahead, the millennium, the messianic age, God's kingdom. When Jesus Christ and the saints are ruling, then of course vast numbers will become spiritual Jews at that time, will become commandment-keeping Christians, as I hope a lot of you are. And I want to go to Luke 12 and verse 32 along those lines. Luke 12 and verse 32. Because commandment-keeping Christians obviously are a small minority of what about 8 billion people in the world at this time. But Jesus says to us in the book of Luke, Luke 12:32, "Do not fear, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." And this is something obviously the Apostle Paul knew. Now Mordecai was a Benjamite, as was the Apostle Paul. And I want to go to what he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, as he's about to be martyred. And yet Paul goes to his death in confidence in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7. I'm sorry, in verse 7. He says, "I have fought the good fight. I'll start in verse 6. "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand." Paul knew he was about to be martyred. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." And now he says, finally, I'm now in verse 8. "There is laid up for me the crown of righteousness." You may remember that Mordecai has a crown there in the 8th chapter of Esther. "Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day." But let's keep reading. "And not to me only, but to all who have loved his appearing. So as we read the book of Esther, there are many points we can, of course, derive from the book. It obviously shows us in a subtle way, but yet in a very powerful way too, divine providence. It shows us, in effect, that humor is a part of the life of a Christian. It also shows us that, unfortunately, persecution is also part of the life of the Christian. But number 4, it also shows us that we are the winners. You know, God is a winner, and we are on God's side. Therefore, ultimately, we are the winners. So these are some lessons that we can derive from the 5th festival scroll. All the best to you and yours.